Sorry about that.
Okay.
I knew better.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I.
Okay, now, the microphones are locked, so everything you say now is going on and is being recorded.
And nothing they say comes back into the line here, so.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple of housekeeping notices is that we're unable to amplify in this room and also have Zoom hear us. So if you may want to relocate if you can't hear well. So we can give everybody the opportunity to do that if you need to. We do have the captions up. And then people who are online, we're having issues getting your audio in this room. So if you use the chat, we're monitoring the chat carefully so that we can include you in our conversations. Shall we get started, Sean?
Yes, we should get started.
All right.
You want me to go?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna. This is an informal presentation on green and gold day. So. First of all, I just wanted to welcome everybody. You know, I know a lot of people couldn't make it to breakfast this morning, but I think what this group has accomplished is really outstanding in terms of. Sorry, don't touch it though, because it might stop working. Don't touch anything. You know, I think in terms of what we've done around accessibility, you know, and the way that it's been done is the quantity of work that people have done. So we've certainly spent time working on it. We've made it a priority, and you know, we've really gotten a good group of people together, and it's expanded over time. So Rebecca and I have been looking at how we go and tell our story. And originally,
Our story meeting, like SUNY Oswego story.
yes, the story of Oswego. And you know, being a university, we need to have some acronyms and like an easy way to go and tell our story. And Rebecca had started with a model that she showed at CIT and really focused on a few areas. And then we've gone and revamped it. And really what we've come up with is a RAMPS model, which we'll share with everyone. But just today is meant both to thank everyone for all the work they've done, and we're sorry those people who couldn't make it here today missed out on a really good breakfast, but also to hear your stories on how you see this model that we're working in. How does it fit in with what you've done and what we've accomplished? And everybody in here has accomplished like a different component of what it is, which is what made our story, I think.
And folks online too. There's a good cohort of people online who've really contributed to our accessibility efforts and continue to. So the QR code up on the screen does take you directly to a variation of this slide deck. It's a slightly more accessible version of this slide deck just because we have a repeated slide in our actual presentation, because we're going to go back and forth to using an interactive form. So we have the slide to get to the form many times in this presentation that you'll see, but in the one that you grab, it's just the last slide. So you can easily find it, but you're not like inundated with the same slide 100,000 times. So it's the same slide deck otherwise.
And I'll also add, since this is being video recorded, there's a lot of people who might be watching it afterwards who played a large part in what we did. I know it's Friday morning after grades are due, so it is a hard time, but it's hard to find any time that fits everyone's schedule.
So we want to introduce you to RAMPS, which is an acronym that stands for, well, it's an acronym that represents a set of tactics that we're all using collectively to really cultivate a culture of access. And these are things that we've observed in our colleagues and have seen people do and know that these are really impactful behaviors. So we're going to go into each one in more detail and have the opportunity for folks to share their own contributions in where they've done these things, so that we can collect some stories. Sean and I are often in rooms where we're asked for examples, and we can give plenty of examples of our own kind of lived experience, but we'd like to be able to provide more diverse examples of the ways that people in really different kinds of roles have embodied these behaviors and have used these tactics to really push our efforts forward. So RAMPS stands for R is for request. A is for amplify. We're going to go into like what they actually mean momentarily. M is for model, P is for prioritize, and S is for support. And if you've seen like my previous presentation on a similar model, it was called Mars. There's some new things that are wrapped into it. So we added the P, and now RAMPS makes more sense because it's already more tied to accessibility in the first place.
Go ahead and hit the space bar, Bob, while you're up. So one thing about the, I think when we think of RAMPS, it really is like how we've gone and set a culture where accessibility and digital accessibility in particular from what we're talking about really fits into the campus priorities, largely around DEI. And what we've really done.
Or diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, I was just gonna say, yeah, very good. And I would say we really focused on how this does go back to a diverse group of people that if we weren't working on these things, they would in essence be marginalized, I think. And they wouldn't have equitable access to the learning resources or the resources that we're really trying to focus on, whether they're on the web or anywhere. And this is certainly a way to go and to include everyone in what we're doing. One of the things that we've really tried to focus on, I remember when we first started, and like we had this model of the whole. I think it came back in that hole that you found, and we kept on making much more content all the time. And unless that wasn't digitally accessible, but now we've gone and kind of reversed that. But I think one of the things that we focused on was how people had different roles inside the campus. And no matter where your role was, you can have influence on on how you have a part, you play a part in the team, in the culture that we have in here. And actually last weekend, we had some slides on this in terms of looking at different roles and everyone can do something. But I was listening to a podcast. It was a Flower Darby podcast on T for Teaching that Rebecca and John had done at last year's CIT. And she was one who reminded me of Covey's circle of influence in terms of where you have. So we all have our own circle of control that we can go and work on and have responsibilities, whether we have what I think of my responsibilities as a CIO, have making sure that we prioritize, put some time aside, put some resources aside. But other people, depending on your position, it might be difficult to do that. But we all have also a circle of influence. And I think the more you go and exercise your circle of influence, actually your circle of control grows as you go back and do that. So I think when we've created this culture where people can speak up and ask for these things, it is really done. And like the teaching and the education that we've done, it really goes and makes a difference. And everyone can have have a way to go and assist inside of this, no matter whether you're a student and you talk to your faculty members and just have, conversations on what helps you and how it can help other students, to faculty members who have control, but inside of a room, you might have more control when you just ask. And Michelle was commenting to you the other day, how people insist on everyone use the microphone now. So I think like we've really gone and done that. So no matter where you are, you have some kind of role and you have some influence on, setting the culture in the organization.
And I think one of the keys is that we often underestimate what we have control over or what we have influence over, right? That we can actually make a difference, and small things actually make large differences. So I want you to keep that in mind as we start going through RAMPS, because even small things or what something that feels really micro or really, really small might start having really, really big impact. So don't discount, right? Or think that like, oh, I haven't actually contributed something here. Really like give yourself credit for some of the things that you probably have done or have started to do or are thinking about moving towards.
Okay, the nice thing about ramps is that Rebecca designed a nice ramp. You know, and to do it. So we have these 5 tactics. You want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Well, with request, really, I think we see so often, I think of just the microphone example in terms of asking people to go and to use a microphone. People can ask for help. They need more digital accessibility. They need different tools. So it really goes, one's asking for, you know, no matter what it is, it's a request and people hardly ever say no if they can really help to do it. So requesting is really a large component of what we're doing. And I think this goes for us. We like to prefer on the carrot rather than the stick in terms of going and doing it. And I think this really helps people to go and to, you know, rather than go and make them do policy, it really helps people to move along and help move this, the initiative forward.
We could easily have chosen the word require, which is what Sean's kind of
Yes.
implying, right? And the reason why we chose request instead of require is because often when you tell someone that they need to do a thing, but there's not a why, and there's not kind of a cultivating of the need and the want to do it, then there's often resistance or doing it in a way that checks a box but doesn't actually help and serve people. But if we're requesting and we're explaining what the needs are or what the barriers are, and that's why we're making the request, then often people can see why that would benefit others, right? And are much more likely to want to help. And that really changes and really aids to this culture of access rather than just checking off access boxes, right? So that's why we chose this word specifically. But you can imagine in certain contexts and where you have control, right? That, you know, in a classroom setting, you could request people follow, you know, accessibility practice, but you could also teach that as part of the curriculum and make it a requirement that's graded, right? So there are ways where it might slip into this requirement as a way to still cultivate a culture.
Maggie has a comment.
From
the chat, I just wanted to share, there's lots of love for the acronym in the chat, and Michelle wanted to shout out an example of this, that there was a lot of collective requests at the Lavender graduation for the speakers to use mics. And so that was a good example of that.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Michelle.
Now, we're gonna ask people here to get out your phones and
The folks online, let me see if I can grab that.
Online will be easier for you. And if you've got stories where you can think of examples of where people were requesting. So Rebecca has designed a,
Oops.
oh, I took this.
You already did it.
It made a form where we can go and easily get stories from people. And we'll just go and collect them and, you know, we'll try to use them as we tell the story of Oswego in time.
So for some context, Sean and I did present this model and talked about some of the work that we've been doing in Oswego at EDUCAUSE, which is a really gigantic conference and organization. And there was a lot of interest in the work that we're doing. And so we're working on an article where we want to share this model and share some really strong examples from different positions. And so we really would like you to try to participate and add some of your examples to this form. It does require you to authenticate just so that like we could follow up with you if we don't understand the example or if we need more details. There's an opportunity there for you to choose which letter on the RAMPS model you want to use, as well as type out a little description and then indicate whether or not you would like to us to share your example anonymously or not. Like, do you want credit or not? So there's all of those abilities in the form.
Okay.
So we'll give folks a few moments to do that. And then we're hoping some of you will also just verbally or in the chat share some of your examples as well.
We're having some trouble getting in.
Okay,
Sign in to continue, but then I click sign in and it keeps
it's spinning.
saying. Sign
Okay.
in. No, it's not spinning, it just keeps doing need to sign in.
That's
I
odd.
think I need to sign in somewhere else first.
With Google?
You have to sign into your Google.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm already in my Google.
Let me see if I can just turn it off.
I think I signed.
Yeah, I'm getting the same issues.
Okay, I'm troubleshooting.
We didn't have anything. We didn't know how to do that at that time. Right, Sean, right from the beginning,
What's that?
how we started.
Yeah. The. Where is that, form, Rebecca? We got it.
It says that you should be able to do it.
The team have personal email, like.
Here, I just changed it so that you have to manually put in your email address rather than it automatically collecting. See if that makes a difference. But please put your email address in it so we know who you are. Otherwise, I don't have a way of collecting. I had set it up to like authenticate so I know who you were.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. And then yeah.
Is it asking for your email address when you're doing it now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. So please include it just so that we can follow up if necessary. Is there anyone that wants to share one of their examples as people are entering things in? Either from the room or in the chat?
We did have a request to go back to the descriptions of each.
Oh, yep.
Okay, well, we're just, okay, yeah. So that was request.
Yep, so we're just doing, we're gonna do each letter, so we're just doing requests right now. Hopefully that's what folks need.
Yeah, so we can let people get started.
Yeah, you should just be able to talk, it's on.
I feel like you could also alternate between request and remind.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
because I think, you know, the example that I shared is requesting, but it's also reminding at the same time, gently.
Yeah, I think that you'll find that many of the letters like kind of lend themselves to some overlap potentially in how you want to think about them.
I'm sure it never occurred to you.
There was another mention of, just thinking about human subjects committee and submitting this, just kind of that. Submitting like the data or the for the study.
When you repeat that.
Yes, yeah, Maggie was saying that we should submit this to IRB so that, because we're asking people to share their stories.
Oh, okay.
This is really, we're working on something that's not really a research study, but rather really just something to share examples. So please don't fill out the form if you don't want your examples shared, but we'll also certainly pursue that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go on to A.
Yeah.
And RAMPS.
Well, did anyone want to share their examples? Anyone have a request example? Where there was the lavender graduation example that Michelle shared.
I think this all started from a request. From a 4 a.m. email that I sent to Rick, and I think Sean was on it, and we had a student, an online student at the time that was requesting, materials in an accessible format, and we weren't sure what that looked like. It was a great deal of materials, and so we met in my office, and it kind of went from there.
Yeah.
It hasn't stopped, in fact, you guys have taken it all.
Yeah.
So.
I hope Terry doesn't mind, but I'm using Terry as an example in that Terry Vargas in the Institute he's always really mindful when planning social media and messaging and presentations of centering digital accessibility. And it's requesting, but it's also reminding again, like, remember, this is important.
Yeah.
So it's been nice to watch and just really own it and help our interns and grad assistants colleagues own it too.
Yeah. There's lots of examples across disciplines as well of faculty introducing some accessibility subject matter as part of the curriculum and thinking about if you're doing a public presentation as part of an assignment or just presenting slides and things in class, some basic accessibility principles to follow and then requiring those as part of the presentation or having that be part of the criteria of how something's evaluated. Casey Raymond and I have talked previously about ways to think about this in a classroom setting that, requiring or having like a rubric item that are accessibility practices is not much different from having a style, right? MLA or APA style as a requirement. It's a similar kind of request. Sorry, I forgot you had it in your hand. No, it's okay.
Makes it easier. Go ahead.
So A is for amplify, and it's really about amplifying voices and perspectives of people with disabilities. And so some of these reminders, right, or speaking up in particular settings can really amplify what maybe some of the barriers folks face are and ways that we can reduce them and really bringing that into the conversation. So one of the examples I like to give is when you're in a committee meeting or you're planning something or in your teams, you're talking about an issue and you can really say, well, what about students with disabilities? Or what about our colleagues with disabilities? Or have we thought about microphones? Have we thought about how the digital communication needs to meet accessibility principles? You might not be aware of, right? And slide in an example. So there's lots of opportunities here where amplification can look really different depending on who's in the room, what kind of power you might feel like you have in the room. This might be one that some folks don't feel as comfortable in certain kinds of spaces speaking up, but others would, right? And where we really need to think about our kind of positional power and where we might feel safe to raise issues. But there's usually some spaces where we feel confident and comfortable where we can amplify the ideas and principles of accessibility and really amplify kinds of barriers that we want to overcome and reduce. Do you want to put up the QR code just for a moment in case people need it again? So it's the same form. If you need the form again, you should be able to keep putting in as many entries as you'd like. Anyone want to share an example? Yeah.
I think most of,
So this is Laura Harris speaking.
I think most of the people here attending know that I have hearing loss. And earlier this in spring semester, I was working with some teacher education students in a class that's specifically about special education. And I typically do disclose my disability to those students because it's relevant to the course material. But this semester, I noticed that when I went around and worked with the students to help them research their individual topics, in one of the sections I worked with, several of the students disclosed their disability to me, which I thought was very interesting and that I think was probably a result of me feeling comfortable enough to disclose my own. So I think that goes back to that idea that representation matters.
Yeah, it's helpful when students feel like they can see themselves, right, in different kinds of scenarios. And when faculty and staff are in a position where they feel comfortable disclosing, you can really feel supportive to students to know that they're not alone, for sure. It can also be really supportive when our colleagues sometimes also may have chosen not to disclose because they felt confident, but then knowing that others may also have disabilities can be really helpful. And but you have to weigh, right? There's risks that we individually can feel when we disclose, right? And we have to feel comfortable, right? But there can be great ways to amplify and make people feel like a sense of belonging.
Rebecca,
Yeah, Pat speaking now.
I was gonna say I was Star. In case this was sideways, that's fine. Well, I can think of two things. When this was all beginning, I remember, we actually recruited a few of our students to actually present and share their experiences. And I think that was pretty impactful for everybody at that table. And for Star and I, we did a focus group 15,000 years ago. I don't know what, it's a long time ago. But it seems, but for us to hear the voices of our students, even though these are students that we have met with, we provided services for, but to hear their voices saying, this is how, that can't be undersold. I mean, because we don't know what's behind people's eyes. So when they're sharing their experiences, it really makes you think, you know, how you do things and why you do what you do. I have a student on campus right now, or in the past semester, who is blind. And I've been escorting them when they were learning their different ways around campus. And I have learned that the ramps in Murano, those little railings and stuff, those are a pain when you're using a cane. I mean, I would have never realized that in a million years. But again, being with this person, experiencing it on the ground level, for me personally, it's changed it. So again, just getting that perspective from students.
Yeah, you're right, Pat, that time when the first year of the Accessibility Fellows program, we had reached out to Pat and Star to see if we could have some students come and talk, just as Pat had mentioned. And it was incredibly powerful and has really altered, frankly, how, like, what some of the fellowship looks like. And some of the content that's a part of the fellowship because of those experiences. I remember one conversation in particular about the accessibility of discussion classes and why some students might actually actively avoid discussion classes. And you know, it sits with me. Like I remember that conversation and really start thinking about why some ways of participation are more difficult than others for folks. Allison.
To add on to the student perspective, at the end of the semester, I was talking to one of the members of, I think it was like the Disability Pride Support Group. Does that sound right? A student organization. She disclosed that she had autism and you know, one of the things that she shared was that growing up, like the only like model she saw of herself like in popular culture was Rain Man, and she felt that was like really unfortunate. And that and I also told her that like my 3-year-old niece has autism, and she said that she, you know, wants to help, you know, help improve things here at SUNY Oswego, but just, you know, in our culture in general, so that as other young people with disabilities grow up, that they do see like positive examples of people with their disability, you know, just doing good things in the world. So.
And the reality is that our environments or the way we set up experiences or set up documents are what often causes us to experience disability, right? If we design it with particular people in mind, they might not. They might have a great time participating in something, right? And this is true of any kind of event, experience, document, et cetera.
Sarah had one.
Yeah.
Yes, so this is Sarah Wiseman speaking. Just making sure that.
Yeah.
Oh, look at it. Yeah, look at that.
What, your role? I am the library director at SUNY Oswego. Building off of what Allison said about showing positive experiences of disability, Maura Harris, a librarian at SUNY Oswego, will be able to corroborate this example. We put up a wonderful display of books about disabilities in the first floor of the library where we put our book displays. And an incoming student, before she had started, saw the display, maybe this is even the same student you're talking about, potentially, Allison. She came up and talked to us at the incoming student, table. And she has since talked to, I think, many of the librarians, expressing her incredibly deep gratitude for seeing positive displays of disabilities. And she said she didn't realize there were such positive representations of people with disabilities. And so that we have amplified the voice of people with disabilities with that display, and we will continue to do so. But that it was so wonderful that student was also in a role of amplifying, right, in terms of like sharing her feedback because of how much that had impacted her. And it has really touched all of us in the library. I mean, I think it's really been a great reminder of the impact we have in the small, like you were saying, Rebecca, the underestimating our control and influence. Like, so we just put up a display of books that we had, right? But it had this incredible impact on the student. And I think it has changed how we all think about the impact that we can have on students.
Thank you. That's a great example.
And I know there's nothing in the chat yet, but you folks feel free to chime in.
If you're filling out the form, you can even copy and paste.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
I have one more. I have one more.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
So Annika McAvoy, who can't pronounce her last name, Deputy CDIO Affirmative Action Officer, she, her. So my example is evolving, but I don't know if folks know, this is really kind of a structural opportunity to amplify. We brought Star Wheeler into the Office of Diversity and Inclusion as the ADA compliance officer for the campus. So that's really still evolving in exciting ways. I can't share all of them, but a core of that work is going to be doing more intentional professional development with faculty and staff around compliance responsibilities, but also opportunities for accommodations and what that can look like. And kind of getting into thinking about from the supervisory perspective, what does it mean to understand that? From the compliance perspective, what does it look like to support that? And then from the consumer perspective, what's available to me and how can I best access it? And then as we move along. So we're really excited about that. So that's that.
Structurally having, divisions and departments and roles that have accessibility and disability associated with their titles demonstrate and amplify that, that accessibility and people with disabilities are important and that we have value, like a value system that aligns with that.
I'd like to go back to that on prioritize.
Yes, we should.
Okay, so then come back to it and prioritize, but model. So in terms of model, I think what we're looking for is once we have the skill set that we ensure that we utilize it and whatever that might mean in terms of, what you're doing and what your job is and what your role is. And you can do that. So I think of myself, I go and try to model the 5 principles wherever I can and go and learn those items and make sure that nothing goes out without an alt text. When I look at the emails that we send out, I look to go in and help there. I know I had Kate work with facilities to go in to make all the emails that they send, all the updates they do if something's broken. And we built a new template for that so that everything was accessible. So I think of that, but then there's far more ways to model depending again on your circle of influence and your role inside of the institution.
I would say model is probably a good entry level RAMPS tactic because it's really about adopting these principles in the work that you do individually, whereas in that kind of sphere of control, right? Am I using the right language?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Where it's like you have control over the things that you create, you have control over the things that you personally distribute. And that's a way to model good practices is just doing the practices. And when you're sharing those materials out, it serves as a model for others. It might be a little more passive than some of the other tactics in that We're just slowly like making more materials and experiences more accessible and not necessarily drawing attention to that. But that all makes a difference and all serves the culture of access.
Yeah,
So I'm positive that everybody has a model example.
you know who does is Carol Willard. Go ahead, Meg. Why don't you go and read the one that she gave us?
All right, so Carol says, overtly share with students how to check for accessibility in all course materials and revise as needed. This is especially important for presentations in a public forum. It is also important for all pre-service teachers to get in the habit of preparing accessible materials from their first methods course, not just for students with disabilities, but for all students, UDL in practice. And Dan Laird mentions, we try to make sure our presentations and documentation from CTS are accessible. To set a good examples, reiterating what Sean was saying. So that's what we got from the chat.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Carol, for sharing. We really appreciate it.
See, faculty who are teaching future teachers have a really big and important sphere of influence and can have a really big impact.
Anybody else have anything?
I'll share.
Great.
When this is kind of request, kind of model, maybe a little bit amplify, I'm not really sure. But anyway, as I'm reviewing websites or when people email me and say, can we put this PDF up on my website? Instead of just complying and being like, yes, okay, customer's always right, whatever. I've gotten into the habit of responding and saying, well, that's not really best practice. So how about we do this instead? Or if I happen to be on a website and I notice that there's bold text instead of headings, or the clickable text is very vague, please click here to do whatever. I will email the department and say, here's my recommendation. I noticed that this was taking place on your website and that's not really best practice. So here's my recommendation of how to fix it. If you have any questions, please call me. And that's like I don't know, I feel comfortable doing that, and it like makes me feel good to know that I'm at least putting the feelers out there to be like, hey, I think you should be aware of this.
Well,
To help fix things.
I would classify that as a request, but you're also modeling amplification, like as a behavior, right? How you amplify.
Go ahead, Maggie.
Michelle Thornton in the chat says, after my time as an accessibility fellow, I created an accessible template for MBA, HSA folks to use for all our syllabi. Carrie also mentions that when working with faculty on online course developments, accessibility is always covered as part of our final course review by the designer.
We're having really great input from everyone, so we really appreciate that. I am also watching the time, so
okay.
We're going to go through and just describe both the P and the S, prioritize and support, and then offer some opportunity for some examples in both of those categories after we've introduced both of them.
Okay, go ahead. Prioritize.
Oh, come on, this is your favorite. You should do this one. Okay.
I'll just say, well, in the end, it really.
This was Sean's primary contribution to this model. This was an important contribution.
Well, I'm sure that particularly, the feedback that many of you receive right off the bat is, oh, this takes so much time and I've got so many other things to do. And really, I agree that our most valuable resource for all of us is our time and where we're going to go and spend it. But if we don't prioritize our time, and I think of it in two ways, is making sure that we set the time, set the goals around it, but also the resources towards doing it. Like in the end, again, your example before was that the institution had made this decision to go and to create this position, and we're going to go and invest in it and set the time aside and have this person work on this item. I think of what we did by bringing Kate in to go and to, invest in that time, make it someone's job to go back and to do it. And then, like in the end, it always takes a village. to go and to do everything that we're doing, but we had our leader and our person, like our boots on the ground. And I also think of the work group on accessibility practices, where you started with, our good friend from, who's now at Upstate. What's her name?
Kristen Flynn.
Kristen Flint, yeah. Yeah, Kristen.
Not good on demand.
You had no idea where I was going with that. Yeah, I mean, in the end, like, it was gone and you folks prioritized your time. And I think of the instructional designers, what they have done to go and to prioritize and work on it and have it grow in that way.
I would say that anyone that's serving on the steering committee or serving on the work group or serving as a fellow have all made a very conscious effort to prioritize. Everyone sitting in the room or on Zoom right now in this session or any of our accessibility sessions is making a decision to prioritize accessibility,
Yeah.
right? And so I think when Sean and I have given presentations and introduced this to different groups, prioritize is sometimes the one that people feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm in a role where I have the power to prioritize. But I think you can think about it both in the individual level, like as an individual, I prioritize my own time, or in my own workflow, I make sure that I do an accessibility check, et cetera. So that's a prioritization in the way that you work. And then there's also ways that you can prioritize within a unit or a division or something.
Yes. I think it's Sarah, you got the accessibility committee inside the library going and working on that. And, what we've done, I say we as in Oswego, you and the library teams, the accessible carols, and all the work that you folks have done. So it's become a priority to go and to do that. What's that?
When you said Carol, it said carrots.
Well, it's important. We do want accessible carrots.
Carrots.
Gary Mosick. When working with faculty on online course developments, accessibility is always covered as part of our final course review by the IDs.
And then we'll just jump to the last one just to make sure we have time to cover it, but please be entering and sharing your examples. The last category is support. And the idea here is that we're supporting others in their accessibility journey through coaching, education, and various processes, right? So this looks different in different contexts, right? In different relationships, but it might be that you're sharing a practice with someone else as a friendly colleague, right? It could be that you're supporting others in their journey by helping them develop arguments for why it's important, right? And sharing some of that information and helping them develop the vocabulary around it or develop some technical skill. It could be that you're in a supervisor role and you're providing the opportunity for someone to get training and things like this, right? These are all ways that we support.
Again, I think the way that the business school has come together in terms of they have some students that need accessibility accommodations. I mean, we have a couple of blind students and a deaf student, but the way that they've gone and proactively gone to turn their models around in terms of what they're going to do, understand the courses that are going to be taken, and go and support has really gotten everyone behind it in terms of also seeing going and doing all of this work up front actually saves you time in the end. So you don't have to go, and he will tell you that remediation takes way longer than going and doing things behind, after reacting with. So I don't know, does other people have stories?
I believe we're officially at time. So we can, if there is an example in the chat, we can take it maybe one last example and then we can wrap up.
There's one example in the chat from Carrie mentioning that there has been great accessibility conversations when covering the Zoom Brightspace office hours with faculty. So relying on those supports are important.
It's a great example.
Does anyone else have it? Yeah, go ahead.
Allison Ayotte, coordinator of academic success and content tutoring in the Office of Learning Services, she, her. I just want to give a shout out to the group, I think a lot of the people were in the room that developed the access course. I think that's a great example of how, you know, it's being prioritized here at SUNY Oswego. And I did see like the group working on, you know, creating the materials last summer, like in the library, because the room they were using is right next to the Office of Learning Services. And I really appreciate that, like, the time was given to people, dedicated time, you know, to do it and to collaborate with other people, because it really does take that time and collaboration to develop a quality product. And like, sometimes I think we're asked to figure out important things on our own, and we can only get so far when we do that. So I just think anytime where there's something that's really important that needs to get done, like, the support has to be behind it, like you said, the time and the funds, and giving people time to get together and work on it.
Well, thank you so much for the advertisement, because that's what we were going to do next. So if you haven't already, please join Access, right? Which is a quest that we are hoping that everyone will join us on to learn more about accessibility. We're in a pilot phase right now. So thinking about prioritization and support, right? Participating right now and providing feedback on what we can do to continuously make it better is really important. So, you know, this is the people who are involved today are really important voices to have in that pilot. So we encourage you to participate and share your feedback. It's in Brightspace, and you can use the Discover tool to add it. And if you need help, let me know, and I can direct you to how to really get going on that if you're interested. And Michelle is online and can also direct folks too.
Michelle in the chat dropped the link to the instructions on joining.
Yeah. So folks that are here, if you need help, you can shoot me an email. I'll send you the link. Last but not least, please note how you're using RAMPS in the works that you're doing, and really think about using RAMPS as a way to talk about what you're doing. So you have some vocabulary, and we can kind of have a consistent way of talking about the advocacy and allyship work that we're doing. And let's all continue to work to reduce and remove barriers for our students and colleagues and our general community. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming and for giving us this great feedback. It's great discussion. Wording, but let's get AI to go on the calendar. Okay.